Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to kind of unpack a story, and I got to say, it's a pretty dramatic one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the relationship between the Soviet Union and China.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone kind of knows they were allies and then enemies, but, we're going deep.
I mean, I love this story, by the way. I think it's super fascinating.
Yeah, and we've got a ton of historical analysis to work with, which is always good.
Hmm.
We'll look at how the Soviets, at first, really helped China out, with their military, with their nuclear program. I mean, really interesting stuff. But of course, then things went sour.
Went very sour, yeah.
And it's interesting how China played a part in the Soviet Union's collapse. I mean, that's the big question. How did these communist giants go from allies to adversaries?
Yeah. And what does that mean for us today?
Exactly. What are the long-term consequences?
Right, because, I mean, this is something that still has an impact on today's world. I mean, when we think about the Cold War, we think about the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, but China and the Soviet Union, that was a huge part of the Cold War as well. Just adds another layer of complexity to it all, right?
Huge.
This should really help show how, ideology and ambition and strategy can really just change everything on the global stage.
Right. It's all connected. Okay, so let's back up. Let's set the scene. 1949, the Chinese Civil War just ended, and the Soviet Union, they're really stepping up to help modernize the People's Liberation Army.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about giving them, a couple extra guns here and there. Right?
No. This is huge. In those early years, the Soviet support was comprehensive. They wanted to modernize the PLA. They gave them military equipment, weapons, everything. Tanks, aircraft, artillery. I mean, just flooding them with Soviet standard weaponry.
Wow. So the PLA was basically becoming a mirror image of the Soviet military in a way.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, obviously, but you get the idea. And they needed people who knew how to use all of that stuff, right?
Yeah. Just having the tanks and planes doesn't win wars.
Exactly. So the Soviets sent in thousands of military advisors. These were high-ranking officers, experienced, the whole 9 yards.
Not just some random recruits.
No, these were the best of the best. They trained the Chinese in everything. Strategy, tactics, logistics, you name it, they taught them.
Okay, so you've got the troops trained up. But it sounds like the Soviets also went a step further. They helped China build its own factories to actually produce military equipment.
That's right. This was huge. They helped develop their industrial and defense infrastructure, setting up factories to produce tanks, aircraft, all that domestically. The goal was for China to become self-sufficient, not just rely on imports.
Right. They wanted to make sure China could sustain itself.
Exactly. I mean, it was an investment in China's future military strength.
And we can't forget about the Navy and the Air Force. It sounds like the Soviets had a hand in those as well.
Yeah, they provided warships to get the Chinese Navy going, and they were really instrumental in helping China build its first jet fighter fleet. That was a huge leap forward for their Air Force.
Right, going from prop planes to jets is a big deal.
Huge deal. And all of this gets cemented, really, with the 1950 Sino-Soviet Treaty. This was the peak of their alliance, at least on paper.
Yeah, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. That's a mouthful.
It is, but it basically says, hey, we're buddies and we're sticking together. A united communist bloc against the U.S. and its allies. It's Cold War politics 101.
Classic Cold War stuff. All right, moving on. Let's talk about something even more serious. The Soviets initially helped China develop its own nuclear bomb. I mean, that's a whole other level of trust and cooperation, right?
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about the most destructive weapons on the planet. Now, there was some hesitation on the Soviet side at first. Another nuclear power popping up is always a bit of a worry, even if they're your ally. But they did provide significant help in the 1950s.
So what kind of help are we talking about? Did they just give them some basic ideas?
Oh, no, this was a big deal. They shared nuclear research, reactor designs, even uranium enrichment techniques. This is top secret stuff. I mean, uranium enrichment is a whole complicated process to make the uranium suitable for a bomb.
Yeah, it's not just digging it up and you're good to go.
Exactly. It's a whole scientific and industrial undertaking. And they gave China the keys to the kingdom, so to speak.
So China's nuclear program was really jump-started by the Soviets. And I understand they also provided the actual materials, right? The enriched uranium, heavy water, all that stuff.
Yeah. Without that, China would have been stuck for who knows how long. It's not easy to get your hands on that stuff.
Not to mention dangerous.
Right. Very dangerous. And they also sent hundreds of Chinese scientists and engineers to the Soviet Union to study nuclear physics. I mean, this was a full-blown knowledge transfer.
So the Soviets were basically setting China up to be a nuclear power. But then, of course, the relationship soured. 1959, the Soviets pulled the plug on the nuclear assistance. That was a major turning point, wasn't it?
It was a huge deal. Khrushchev decides, nope, no more help. And that forced China to go it alone. But they had gotten a huge head start thanks to those initial years of Soviet help. And just 5 years later, in 1964, they test their first atomic bomb.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty incredible. They managed to do it on their own.
It shows how determined they were. But let's talk about why the relationship fell apart. It's not just one thing, it's a whole bunch of factors.
Yeah, what caused this so-called betrayal? What went wrong?
Well, there were ideological differences. Mao Zedong saw Khrushchev as too soft, not a real communist. You know, when Khrushchev denounced Stalin in '56, Mao saw that as a betrayal of the revolution.
So this is a clash of personalities as much as ideologies.
Totally. Mao thought he was the true heir to Lenin, the real deal. He thought the Soviets were becoming too cozy with the West.
And then you had those border disputes flaring up. I mean, it went beyond just words, didn't it?
Yeah, in 1969, there were actual armed clashes along the Ussuri River. These weren't just skirmishes, they were real battles. Two communist powers shooting at each other, it was a mess.
Wow. Talk about a sign that things have gone completely wrong. And of course, there was this competition to be the leader of the communist world.
Right. Mao wanted China to be at the top, not the Soviets. He saw them as declining, losing their grip. And when the Soviets pulled out of the nuclear program, that just added fuel to the fire.
Yeah, that must have felt like a real slap in the face.
Totally. And so, by the early 1960s, you have the official Sino-Soviet split. China's calling the USSR imperialist, revisionist, all that. Mao even accuses Khrushchev of colluding with the U.S.
I mean, that's a serious accusation, especially during the Cold War. It's like playing right into the enemy's hands.
Exactly. So now you have these two former allies who are helping each other build up their militaries, pointing nukes at each other. It's pretty crazy when you think about it. But the story doesn't end there. Now, the question is, how did China actually contribute to the Soviet collapse?
Yeah, because they did, and that's the mind-blowing part. How does a country that was so reliant on the Soviets turn around and help bring them down? It's a huge shift.
It is, and it's a long game, playing out over decades. You can point to 1972 as a key moment. Mao meets with Nixon, the U.S. president. That sends a huge signal to the world.
That's wild. Going from the Soviets to their biggest rival, the U.S., it's a huge geopolitical realignment.
It's like two enemies teaming up against a common foe. It throws everything up in the air. And for China, it opens up trade with the West. They get aid. Their economy starts to grow.
And the Soviets are watching this, feeling more and more isolated.
Yeah, they're stuck in the Cold War, spending a ton of money on their military. And here's China making deals with the enemy.
Not to mention, China is now supporting anti-Soviet groups around the world.
Right, arming and training them in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. It's a way to poke at the Soviets, drain their resources.
Death by 1,000 cuts.
Exactly. And you still have those border tensions. The Soviets have to kit hundreds of thousands of troops along that border, just in case.
Talk about a drain on the budget. I mean,
Yeah.
all that money could have been used for other things.
Right, but they had no choice. And then in the 1980s, you see this big difference in economic performance. China's reforms under Deng Xiaoping are working. Their economy is booming.
And the Soviet economy is stagnant. People are unhappy.
Right. It's a stark contrast. The Soviet system is looking more and more outdated, and China's success is a direct challenge to that.
And let's not forget about those nationalist movements within the Soviet Union.
Right. China was encouraging them, especially in Central Asia. It's subtle, but it adds to the pressure on the Soviet system. I mean, the USSR was a patchwork of different ethnicities and nationalities.
It wasn't a homogenous society.
Exactly. So all of this comes together in 1991. The Soviet Union collapses, and China, which was once reliant on them, is now a rising power.
It's almost unbelievable, this whole chain of events. You couldn't make this stuff up. So we've gone from alliance to betrayal to, I guess you could say, revenge.
Yeah, it's a wild ride. The Soviets helped China, then they betrayed them, and China, in a way, got their revenge. But it's more complex than that, right? It's about ideology, strategy, ambition.
It's a story that shows how quickly things can change on the world stage.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder what alliances or rivalries today might be heading down a similar path. I mean, history has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it?
It sure does. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
As always, a pleasure to be here.
And for our listeners, think about what we discussed today. Look at the world around you. What alliances seem unbreakable? What rivalries seem eternal? Because as this story shows, nothing is set in stone. The future is always full of surprises.
And those surprises can be world-changing.
So stay informed, stay curious, and keep questioning everything. Until next time, this is The Deep Dive, signing off.